There's a strange kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being unseen, but from being seen only in fragments, admired for your insight, respected for your strength, but never quite known. If you identify as an INFJ or INTJ, you may recognize this feeling not as occasional, but as persistent. A quiet distance between you and the people who try to get close, no matter how well-intentioned they are. It's not that you lack emotion or connection or the desire to belong. It's that you've learned, slowly and with great subtlety, how to make yourself unreadable, not to deceive, but to survive. Over time, this unreadability becomes its own kind of personality. The composed exterior, the sharp intuition, the minimal speech. People describe you as private, intense, enigmatic, and they're not wrong. But what they don't see is that those traits were not born out of preference. They were constructed, they were chosen, often unconsciously, as part of a larger design to shield the parts of you that once hoped too loudly, felt too deeply, or broke too easily under the weight of other people's neglect. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And maybe that's the root of the design, the unwillingness to be fully known, because being known also means being held accountable to your own need. So instead, you build, you refine, you learn to self-contain, and somewhere along the way, you stop waiting for others to reach you. You become efficient at everything except intimacy. You become safe, but not seen, needed, but not truly known. This isn't a condemnation. It's a recognition. You are not unlovable. But if you've made yourself emotionally inaccessible in the name of strength, then it's worth asking, did you build yourself into a fortress? And if so, do you still know where the doors are? If that question lingers somewhere in you, if you've ever feared that your independence is just loneliness dressed up in competence, then stay with me. This video isn't about breaking down your defenses. It's about understanding why they were built in the first place, and whether they're still serving you or silently starving the very connection you thought they would protect. If you're the kind of person who searches for meaning in quiet places, who values clarity over comfort and depth over display, then consider subscribing or saving this to return to later. I make videos like this for people like you, not to feed the algorithm, but to speak into the silence you carry so well. In the next chapter, we'll explore why INFJs and INTJs so often appear difficult to love, not because they are emotionally closed, but because they've learned to open only in ways that others rarely recognize. There's something quietly tragic about being the kind of person others admire from a distance, but hesitate to approach. INFJs and INTJs live with this paradox constantly. On the surface, they evoke curiosity, even reverence, sharp minds, composed presence, a depth that suggests meaning beyond what is spoken. And yet time and again, relationships falter, friendships fade, intimacy stalls before it ever begins. Not because there is nothing there, but because there is so much there, and none of it feels immediately safe to reveal. What's more disorienting is that this distance often feels involuntary. You want to connect, you want to be known, and yet the moment someone gets too close, something subtle shifts. Your words become more measured, your reactions delayed. You sense yourself pulling back, even as part of you longs to lean in. Over time, you learn to call this restraint maturity. You convince yourself that detachment is a form of strength, and the world agrees with you, until the ache beneath that restraint begins to speak more loudly than the silence you've used to conceal it. So, the question must be asked. Are INFJs and INTJs hard to love because others lack the depth to reach them, or because they've spent years perfecting the art of not being reached? It's not an easy thing to admit, but it's essential. Because the defenses of both types are not crude walls thrown up in fear. They are intricate systems of control, built in the name of emotional survival. INFJs often defend through emotional giving. They listen, empathize, and intuitively soothe, but rarely disclose. They connect by making others feel seen, but remain unrevealed themselves. INTJs, by contrast, defend through intellectual self-sufficiency. They systematize their world, suppress emotional volatility, and project a kind of distant calm that feels confident on the outside, but often masks deep uncertainty within. And here's the thing, these strategies work. INFJs and INTJs often do avoid the chaos and pain that comes from unchecked emotional exposure, but the cost is profound. They become unreachable, not because they are impenetrable, but because they have made the conditions for access so high, so narrow, so quietly unspoken that no one ever qualifies. Jung once observed, "What you resist persists." And for these types, what is often resisted is vulnerability, not because they're unaware of it, but because they understand its consequences all too well. To be vulnerable is to risk chaos. It is to open the door not only to love, but to disappointment, abandonment, misinterpretation. And when you've spent years building an identity around internal control, that kind of risk can feel indistinguishable from self-betrayal. But ask yourself honestly, how many times have you expected others to intuit your pain without you ever naming it? How often have you hoped someone would push past your resistance just to prove they cared while punishing them quietly for failing to do so? This is not manipulation, it's grief. It's the echo of unmet need translated into behavioral logic. Somewhere along the way, you learned that voicing your vulnerability meant burdening others, or worse, inviting judgment. So you refined your emotional presence into something cleaner, more elegant. You showed insight instead of need, offered clarity instead of confusion. You made yourself lovable in theory, but unavailable in practice. And over time, that unavailability starts to feel like reality. You stop expecting closeness. You call yourself self-sufficient. And you become, slowly and without realizing it, a kind of ghost in your own life. Present, helpful, intelligent, admired, but not truly known. This isn't your fault, but it is your pattern. And if that pattern sounds familiar, if you've ever waited for someone to understand your silence only to resent them when they didn't, then stay with me. Because in the next chapter, we're going to trace that pattern to its quiet origin. Not fear of love, but fear of what love demands in return. There's a particular kind of sadness that follows the INFJ. Not dramatic, not visible, but steady and almost sacred, like a chapel hollowed by silence. It's not that they are chronically unhappy. It's that they carry an awareness of pain, both their own and others, so constant, so unrelenting, that it eventually becomes part of the atmosphere. And the tragedy is that no one sees it. Because INFJs, by nature, do not shout their pain, they encode it in empathy. From an early age, they learn that their emotional intuition is a gift, one that helps others feel known, soothed, even redeemed. But like all gifts, it comes at a cost. For the INFJ, that cost is often invisibility. They grow up being the one who understands, who listens without judgment, who translates chaos into coherence. But while they are decoding the emotions of others, few people ever stop to ask what they themselves are carrying. And so they begin to disappear, not physically, but energetically. Their presence remains, but their emotional transparency fades, not as an act of deception, but of self-preservation. What begins as compassion evolves into silence. What begins as harmony slowly becomes moral exhaustion. The INFJ doesn't withdraw in anger. They withdraw in quiet disbelief, a slow realization that their emotional availability has not been met with reciprocity, that the people they've poured into rarely notice when they begin to fade. And when this happens enough times, something shifts. The warmth doesn't vanish, but it is no longer offered freely. It becomes conditional, not on love, but on safety. And when safety is absent, so is the INFJ. This is the birth of the shadow, subtle, silent, often unnoticed, even by the INFJ themselves. Their extroverted feeling, once directed outward to preserve harmony and support others, turns inward. It calcifies. It begins to operate like a cold, ethical filter. Who deserves my energy? Who has earned the right to know how I feel? It's not vindictive, it's efficient. It's the emotional equivalent of budgeting after years of giving everything away. But here's where the danger sets in. Because the INFJ has spent so long being seen as kind, thoughtful, emotionally wise, they begin to believe that withdrawing in silence is more virtuous than expressing their disappointment. And so their pain never takes a clear shape. It becomes ambient, it becomes distance, and soon they are no longer a presence in others' lives. They are a memory of comfort, a ghost. You've probably felt this if you identify as an INFJ, the moment when you realize someone has no idea what they've taken from you. The hollow silence after an interaction where you gave again and received nothing in return. The quiet moment when you leave, not with a scene, not with words, but with your energy, your empathy, your emotional investment, and no one even notices you're gone. The greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all. Søren Kierkegaard. The INFJ doesn't just ghost others, they ghost themselves. They begin to bypass their own emotional needs because voicing them feels either futile or inappropriate. They become selective with their presence, not to punish others, but to reduce the sting of repeated misattunement. And eventually, the emotional core that once animated their relationships becomes walled off beneath layers of interpretation, intuition, and moral restraint. But here's the question no one asks. At what point does empathy become avoidance? At what point does protecting your heart start starving it? Because for the INFJ, the greatest danger is not emotional collapse. It's becoming so good at managing emotional risk that they no longer take any, so good at understanding others that they forget to reveal themselves, so practiced in silence that they forget how to say, "I need you." If that sounds familiar, if you've ever pulled away and then wondered why no one followed, stay with me. Because in the next chapter, we're going to look at the other side of this emotional withdrawal. Not the INFJ's vanishing, but the INTJ's eruption. If the INFJ defends by becoming invisible, the INTJ defends by becoming impenetrable. Their world is built on logic, precision, structure, internal systems designed not only to organize reality, but to prevent it from becoming emotionally volatile. To be an INTJ is, in many ways, to carry a quiet blueprint for life, a way of seeing patterns before others notice them, of predicting outcomes, of optimizing for efficiency. And behind this blueprint is not just intellect, but something far more fragile, something rarely acknowledged even by the INTJ themselves. Beneath the confidence and detachment lies a profound need for integrity. Not just moral integrity, but structural. The sense that things should work, that relationships should function, that people should follow through. This unspoken idealism is what makes the INTJ both powerful and vulnerable. Because when systems fail, when people don't follow through, when emotions create chaos, when life violates their internal code, the INTJ doesn't just feel frustrated, they feel betrayed. Their first instinct is to restore order. They double down on control. They withdraw into planning, analysis, execution. But when the system continues to fail, when logic cannot repair the emotional breach, the INTJ begins to fray. And unlike the INFJ, who retreats into silence, the INTJ begins to burn. It starts subtly, a shorter fuse, a sense of restlessness in situations that once felt manageable. Plans are revised not out of inspiration, but from distrust. Conversations feel increasingly inefficient. People become variables too chaotic to include in the next equation. The INTJ begins to isolate, not physically, but psychologically. Not because they don't care, but because their caring has no rational outlet. This is the INTJ's shadow, not coldness, but emotional volatility wearing the mask of calculation. It is the internal collapse of a system that has been over-leveraged for too long. And when it happens, the INTJ doesn't simply withdraw. They question the foundation. They start to ask, why bother? Why build? Why trust? And once they ask those questions, it becomes difficult to stop. When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Friedrich Nietzsche. For the INTJ, the abyss is not chaos. It is futility. A quiet sense that all their emotional restraint has amounted to nothing, that the people they gave chances to failed them, that the structures they built were never respected. And when this realization hits, the INTJ doesn't lash out indiscriminately. They turn inward with a scalpel. They begin to dissect every past decision, every connection, every expression of hope, and discard what no longer serves. They don't explode. They purge. This is not growth. This is grief with a whiteboard. And because the INTJ is often seen as independent, no one notices their unraveling. They still perform. They still produce. But beneath the output is a growing disillusionment with the very systems that once gave their life clarity. What's worse, they often rationalize this collapse as evolution. I've grown. I'm done wasting energy. I just don't tolerate people anymore. But in truth, they haven't grown out of hope. They've just been burned enough to stop expressing it. What makes the INTJ difficult to love in these moments is not their mind. It's their invisibly guarded emotional world. The part of them that wants to be known without having to perform. The part that tests others without giving them instructions. The part that waits for loyalty but never articulates what loyalty would actually look like. So ask yourself, have you ever punished someone silently for failing to meet a standard you never expressed? Have you ever sabotaged closeness by insisting on control? Have you ever told yourself that independence is a virtue, when really it was just the safest available exit? Because if that sounds like you, even faintly, then you already know the next question. What happens when you want love but can't let it in? That's where we're going next. At some point, the loneliness stops feeling accidental. It stops feeling like a mismatch of timing, a lack of compatible people, or a side effect of your personality. Instead, it starts to feel like a consequence, one you cannot fully explain, but can't pretend not to notice. For both INFJs and INTJs, this realization tends to arrive quietly in the pauses between distractions. It may come after a conversation that felt emptier than it should have, after the end of a relationship that never really began, after years of pouring yourself into others, strategically, emotionally, loyally, only to find that no one truly knows how to reach you. And that's the paradox, because you do want to be reached, not just understood intellectually, but known, felt, trusted, accepted, without needing to explain every nuance of your internal world. But at the same time, you've spent so long refining your emotional privacy that even you don't know what full openness would look like anymore. You want love, but you've built yourself to resist it. Not because you're afraid of closeness itself, but because you know what closeness demands: vulnerability, compromise, chaos, visibility. And those things are not flaws to you, they're liabilities. You've trained yourself to excel in structure. You function in clarity. You thrive in emotional clean rooms. But love is none of those things. It is messy. It is ambiguous. It asks you to be seen not in your refinement, but in your rawness. And that, for both INFJs and INTJs, feels like a risk they cannot afford to take unless they are absolutely certain they will not be abandoned. But certainty is not part of human intimacy. Love, by nature, is uncertain. And so you hesitate. You test. You withhold. You wait for the other person to prove something impossible, that they will never fail you, never misunderstand you, never mishandle the tender things you reveal too slowly, too cautiously, too late. And when they fail, as they inevitably do, you call it confirmation. I knew it. I knew I was too much. I knew they weren't safe. But the truth is more painful. They didn't fail you. They just never had enough information to reach you in the first place. Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Carl Jung. So you remain in control. You perform competence. You protect your inner life by reducing access to it. And over time, that protection becomes indistinguishable from isolation. You tell yourself you're not lonely. You're just particular. You tell yourself that people disappoint you, but never ask whether you gave them the map. And slowly, you become the architect of your own emotional starvation. This is the quiet heartbreak of being unlovable by design, not because you lack worth, but because somewhere along the way, you decided, perhaps rightly, that being loved conditionally was worse than not being loved at all. And so now you wait. You wait for someone who sees through your silence, who passes all your tests, who proves themselves before you even begin to reveal yourself. But in doing so, you forget the most crucial part, that love cannot reach a person who refuses to open the door unless the guest already knows the floor plan. If this sounds familiar, if you've ever found yourself lonely in a room full of people who think they know you, then stay with me, because in the final chapter, we're going to look at what happens when you stop performing safety and start inviting something deeper. Not certainty, not perfection, but wholeness. If this part of the journey echoes anything unspoken inside you, save the video or quietly share it with someone who's never asked you to explain who you are. Sometimes being understood begins with being seen, even in silence. At some point in your life, maybe early, maybe often, you realized that being open came at a cost, that asking for what you needed made people uncomfortable, that expressing disappointment made you seem ungrateful, that being emotional, in the wrong context, gave others the power to label you as too much, too intense, too complicated. So, you adapted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but structurally. You rewired how you showed up. You made yourself easier to love by making yourself harder to affect. And it worked. You became strong. You became discerning. You built routines that insulated you from chaos, boundaries that protected you from intrusion, systems that made your inner world livable, efficient, safe. But somewhere in that process, you stopped noticing how much you were withholding. You stopped noticing how little of you was actually visible to others. You thought you were being measured. In truth, you were disappearing. The irony is that INFJs and INTJs do not fear intimacy in the abstract. They fear what happens when it goes wrong, what it does to their sense of self, what it costs them to repair. And so they preempt the injury by designing an identity that rarely invites others past the outer gate. But eventually, that strategy, brilliant as it once was, becomes the prison. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Breaking the design doesn't mean tearing down your defenses all at once. It means questioning them. Asking not, is this wall justified, but is this wall still needed? It means showing someone a little more than is comfortable, not recklessly, not without discernment, but with the awareness that love without exposure isn't intimacy, it's performance. For the INFJ, it means learning that boundaries are not the opposite of connection. They're the condition for authentic connection. It means saying I'm tired instead of smiling, saying I need instead of implying, choosing clarity over mystery, even when mystery feels safer. For the INTJ, it means recognizing that vulnerability isn't chaos. It's data, emotional data. And just like any system, it must be tested, refined, allowed to fail. It means allowing others to witness your process, not only the outcome. It means allowing presence to matter more than proof. Neither of these journeys are easy, but they are necessary because the truth is, you were never unlovable. You were just trying to love yourself in the safest way you could. So now the question becomes, is safety still the priority, or is truth? If this series met you in a place you didn't know needed language, consider subscribing or saving the video. Not for the algorithm, but for yourself. So when the old design starts whispering again, you'll remember there's another way to be seen.